That's a good morning. Daniel, we're not allowed to talk.
No more talk.
Remember, it's still live after the talk, too, until we shut off the recording.
Right. I'm going to do this animation test. Such a good idea.
That is a live mic.
How many people?
During the recording,
Yeah.
Oh, here. Oh, yeah, no, look at the Well, pull up my lunch too. Yeah. Turning off my cell phone. Oh, this is from you. Yes. Okay. Always know. I just realized I forgot to finish my lunch. Yeah. Okay. I got my
noisiest lunch, but I didn't see any alternative. It's turned out for this. Yeah. I swear, the weather is starting to. Yeah.
So, yeah, I heard
I depend on collaborators.
I hear you on that. Are you actually with someone on the West Coast right now?
And there's things in his work day to do it. Yeah, you guys sit down.
They're all very easy people. You know, and I don't want to nudge too much, but I do eventually say, can you update me where we are? You know, they say, oh, I'm really sorry. This month, hope you get to this next month. It's been going on for like 2 years for each of 19th century. you know, so it's frustrating because I'm excited about the project. I really want to see them come to fruition. Okay, sure.
It's so much time.
It's hours.
Hours. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I was a little bit concerned. So it might be a little crowded, but it'll be full. Oh, and that's there you go. I know.
Oh, really?
So to do the yeah, right.
No,
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah, there's a small area.
We don't know.
yeah, right. It's specifically
Yeah, but it is.
but we also
Yeah. Yeah, but they would.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Ricciuti lecture series of human development. So I want to say a few words about this lecture series, which is in honor of our late colleague, friend, and mentor, Dr. Henry Ricciuti. For those of you who are new in the department, Dr. Ricciuti served on faculty in human development from 1958 to 1988. And after retired and became an emeritus professor, he continued to come to his office almost every day, probably more frequently than many of our faculties here. And with his door open, and everybody can just jump in and to say hi or to ask questions from where the field is going to where to take a summer vacation in the Finger Lakes area. So he has been a very instrumental member. He was a very instrumental member of the department. Dr. Ricciuti is known for his work on early childhood development, especially factors associated with emotional and cognitive development in infants and young children. He was very active in the field, serving various leadership roles in the field of child development, and he published very widely, both in and outside of the field. And he also mentored numerous graduate students and junior colleagues. And he served twice department chairs, which I think he deserved some credit. So in 2001, Dr. Ricciuti received the SRCD Award for distinguished contributions to public policy for children. Since the inauguration of this Ricciuti lecture series in 2004, we have had many distinguished speakers, and today we're welcoming our 15th speaker, someone we feel truly honored and so excited to have here. And our Dr. Kushner will introduce our speaker.
So maybe I'll start, since you talked about Henry. I'll say that I have very few memories of him because we didn't overlap by much, but his office used to be across from mine when he was still emeritus professor here. And the first time I went in to talk to him, I noticed something that he actually has in common with my former mentor, Susan Gelman, which is that I just went in and I said, and he said, let's talk about babies. And I said, okay, what's the nature of representation? And his eyes lit up and he gave me like a stack of papers and we started talking and we talked for like an hour and I lost track of time. And the excitement that he had, that spark, and for everyone who knew him, probably more than I did, it was very easy to spend time with him and see how enthusiastic, almost childlike enthusiasm for the work that we do. And I think that's something that I also feel is true of all of my conversations with Susan. So let me give you the facts first. It is an incredible honor, and I'm very nervous to introduce Susan Gelman as our speaker today. Maybe more nervous than I've been to introduce anyone ever. Susan is a Heinz Werner Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She has been on the faculty there since 1984. She got her PhD at Stanford. She actually went to Oberlin College for undergrad, which I was very excited to learn. So that's a beautiful place. Her PhD research was with Alan Markman, and since those many years ago, she's gone on to influence, had far-reaching influence both in our fields and across psychology and cognitive sciences and philosophy, and even artificial intelligence. I know a couple of you from my class are here, so and other of the cognitive sciences. As far as human development, I started making a list for all the topics that we care about that Susan has worked on and has made profound strides in. Most basically, she's interested in concepts, and she's going to talk about that today, and also language and the relation between the two. But that doesn't really do justice to the number of topics that she's covered. So I just started listing the things I know about rather than make you read 36 pages of a CV. So starting with, of course, the way that the human mind makes sense of the natural world, and also of man-made objects, of the social world, and of things like identity, group membership, especially gender identity is a topic she's worked a lot on, and other things, of health and illness, of authenticity, and of why we care about certain human origins, of important works of art, for example, or even your favorite stuffed animal. Children's expressions of originality through the way they use language, arguing about links between language and creativity, one of my favorite of her pieces of work, of theoretical work. Learning and conceptual change, culture and individual differences, and the list just goes on and on. I think for every person here who's not familiar with her work, if there's a topic in human development or in cognitive science more generally that you care about, you go and look. Susan has written something on that topic that I guarantee will inspire you and will make you want to learn more about her approach. She's also responsible for making methodological advances in the study of children's conceptual and language development, including carefully controlled experiment and on also extracting meaningful systematic data from naturalistic observations of children and in conjunction with their environments, their families, their parents, their friendships, etc. When I first met Susan and started spending time in her lab, it changed the way that I do my work in many ways. First of all, it made me have aspirational goals to be something when I grew up, and I was already quite grown up at that point and a mother of two. So if you had asked me at that point, what do you want to be when you grow up, I would have said Susan. And I was told that, of course, it's really hard to do this without embarrassing her because she is so humble. I want to tell you a little last final thing about the connection between the enormous amount of service that she's done for our field and the amount of mentorship accolades that she has received from many people, including the Division 7 APA G. Stanley Hall Mentorship Award in 2016, another APA Mentorship Award in 2012. She's a fellow of many societies, the National Academy of Sciences, American Psychological Association, the Cognitive Science Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. These are all in part due to her accomplishments, but also to her service, I think, and the way that she connects with so many people, both people who've worked for her and people who know her work in other ways. I can't, I have to stop at some point. If you looked through, you're going to see as many ways in which Susan has done things for her own institution as well as for others across our field. You'll see ways in which she's taken care of students, even ones that she hasn't even met yet. Today, I'm hoping some of mine will be inspired by her. And in addition to that, I can't do this. I really can't. All right. Wow, I really can't do this. I don't know what to say except that she doesn't. She'll never stand up and tell you what an important person she is, and she doesn't like when other people do it. But it doesn't matter how many accomplishments are listed. I think the most important thing about Susan is that same thing I said when I started out, which is the thing that sparked, the spark that Henry had, and the spark that Susan had, and the spark that people who come and give this lecture have, to care about the ideas more than we care about anything else. And anyone else who can connect to those ideas is therefore truly valued in her eyes. So without further ado, I'll let her talk more about what she's going to talk about later.
Thank you so much, Laura. We go back a long way, and it's very hard to encapsulate a relationship in 5 minutes, and that was really beautifully done, so thank you. And I'm really honored. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here to honor Henry Ricciuti. I looked at the list of former speakers, and it's really very humbling. And I'm really delighted to talk to you today about some of the ideas that I've been pursuing. Is this a good place for me to stand? Okay. I'm talking about essentialism, and that can seem sort of like a technical word. So I want to start with a very concrete example. I'm going to refer to an event that took place a couple of years ago. You may remember the North Carolina so-called bathroom bill, which said that people had to use the bathroom that corresponded to the sex that's listed on a person's birth certificate. And this was an idea that was very controversial, but also had strong support. So what would this mean for Sarah McBride? So based on her name, her appearance, and her own identity, she would have preferred to use the women's bathroom, but she was born Tim McBride. She was transgender and changed her gender in college. She was actually president of the student body at American University. So according to the bathroom bill, despite all of the ways in which she appeared to be female and thought of herself as female and appeared to others as female, she would use a male bathroom. So how can we understand this? And I want to say, first of all, this really is not about bathrooms, right? It's about categories. It's about male and female. And it's about kind of instantiating legally people's concepts of what it means to have a certain gender. So if you wanted to map it out, you might say, well, okay, someone has a superficial appearance, but also there's a deeper reality that may be distinct from appearance, and that also there's some sort of hidden quality, you might call it an essence, that's causally responsible for someone's deeper reality, and in many cases for their superficial appearance as well. And so you can characterize this as psychological essentialism. This is an idea that goes way back. William James talks about essentialism. Allport talks about essentialism. Of course, I've written about it. Doug Nadine has some really nice papers on it as well. So the idea is that when you have a concept in your mind, you see it as fixed, deeply informative, having a biological basis, unchanging, and where appearances can be deceiving. So in the case of Sarah McBride, her appearance was female, but the people who instantiated the bathroom bill would say at a deeper reality she's male, and really it boils down to her chromosomes. Now, interestingly, if you look at how Sarah McBride discussed her own gender identity, so now we're not talking about biological gender, biological sex, but gender identity, you see a different kind of essentialism that's a very similar framework, but opposite. So she wrote an op-ed piece which she called The Real Me, and she talked about her gender identity, and here are some quotes directly from that article. For me, it has been present my whole life, but for the longest time I couldn't accept it. Today is the next day of the life I've already had. This is when she was coming out as transgender. But at the same time, the first day of the life I always knew I wanted to lead. Starting on Saturday, I will present as my true self. I'm now blessed with the opportunity to live my dream and fulfill a truth I've known since childhood. So she's also very essentialist, but with it flipped around. So to her, her appearance with a male body is just appearance. The deeper reality is her female identity, and that has some sort of essential cause, unspecified. I suggest, she might construe it as genetic, but we really don't know. But it's, again, unchanging and deep and has consequences. Okay, now, it turns out if you ask adults in the US, they often will endorse essentialist beliefs. And people have asked this by just giving questionnaires and having people rate on Likert scales how much they agree or disagree with various essentialist propositions. And you find that people often will say, everyone's either male or female, there's nothing in between. They'll highly endorse statements like this. People cannot change whether they're shy, even if they want to. People are born with a predisposition to have a certain learning style. I think the chief reason why parents and children are so alike in behavior and character is that they possess a shared genetic inheritance, and so on. So I deliberately selected examples from different studies that have examined different aspects of human variation, and very widely, essentialist endorsements can be found across a broad range of concepts, gender, race, intelligence, behavior, and so on. Now, at this point, it's really important for me to clarify that I'm not making a metaphysical claim about the structure of the world. I, in fact, think that essentialism, I'll talk about some ways in which it has components that fit with reality, but it's also really important from my perspective to understand ways in which it does not fit reality. So I see it as a cognitive bias. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples of how reasoning about categories as kind of fixed, immutable, with these deep implications can really mismatch the variability that in fact is found in the world. And one way that people have written about a lot in the past century is beliefs about human evolution. So if you ask AAAS scientists, 98% strongly support the idea in Darwinian evolutionary theory that humans and other living things have evolved over time. That's like uncontroversial, except for that 2%. I don't know about that 2%. But if you ask US adults, this is a nationally done survey, this is quite typical. This is from the Pew Research Center. Most adults in the US, this ranges from like about 50 to like mid 60s. Most adults in the US will say, yeah, evolution is real, but like between 30 and 50% of adults reject evolutionary theory, specifically as it applies to humans, and instead say that humans have existed in the present form since the very beginning. So that's an essentialist idea, that the categories that exist in the world are real, unchanging, stable entities that can't shift. Okay, so a misconception that links to essentialism. Another example has to do with how people reason about genetics and how genes link to human variation. This is one item of a longer survey that was done by Christensen et al., where they surveyed, again, it was a national survey of US adults, and they were interested in how people understood genes. So I'm not talking about how a biologist would talk about genetics, but rather what's the uptake in sort of everyday adults. And so they had items like this that people could agree or disagree with. And most people agreed with this statement. Again, it's emblematic of the sort of misconceptions that people had. So most people thought that it's true that two people from the same race will always be more genetically similar to each other than two people from different races, as if race, whatever that means, is maps onto almost like different species, and that there's variation within and variation within, but no variation that across you don't see similarity. And this is just simply false. Further, and I will get to kids very soon, but I think it's important to get the context of why I think essentialism is important to study. There has been a lot of work looking at what adult essentialism of social categories predicts. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from some recent work that we have done. So adults who are more essentialist about certain categories like race tend to engage in more stereotyping and prejudice. Higher levels of essentialism correspond to higher levels of thinking that people should be punished if they engage in like criminal activities, for example. So if you centralize criminals, then you think that they should be punished more. Racial categorization, so there's an interaction between essentialism and negative attitudes that leads to certain kinds of ways of categorizing multiracial individuals. And support for boundary enhancing policies. So political support for policies that involve grouping people and imposing boundaries. So this is work that I've done with Stephen Roberts and Arnold Ho and Marjorie Rhodes. Now, important to see here is that we found that people who essentialized were more likely to support policies that disadvantage social groups, like the bathroom bill that I talked about. Also, many of Trump's policies are actually really, again, very much about categories and putting boundaries between categories, like the wall between the US and Mexico, banning certain groups from the US, and so forth, as well as those that advantage certain social groups. So it's not a conservative liberal sort of thing. It's at a level that transcends the political category, the political sort of categories that we have between, you know, Democrat and Republican, for example. So services that benefit LGBTQ individuals, for example, are more endorsed by those who endorse essentialism, and this is controlling for a variety of other sorts of factors that you might think would be confounded with that. Okay, so why do we essentialize? So, so I wrote a book about this about 15 years ago, and one basic message from my book was that kids essentialize in a very sort of intuitive way from a very early age, even preschoolers essentialize. Now, I still think that that's true, and I'm going to say a little bit about why, but in the 15 years since, the picture has gotten a lot more complicated for me as well. And I've come to really see that issues of language, of identity, and of culture complicate the picture additionally. So what I hope to do in the time that we have is to sort of walk through some of the evidence that children are essentialists, but then also some of the ways that complicate that picture. And I've structured this in terms of 3 takeaway points. Children are little essentialists. Cultural context matters. And language transmits essentialism implicitly. So, you know, if all you take away are those 3 points, I'll be happy, but you're not gonna believe me unless I give you evidence to support these points. So, okay, so before I get into the evidence for childhood essentialism, I wanna remind you, this is kind of the basic structure again, where the idea is that there's a deeper reality that underlies superficial appearances, and that there's some sort of causal factor that gives rise to the properties of both the ones we see and the ones we don't see. But the dotted lines here represent that people wouldn't normally be able to tell you what that essence is. It's just a commitment to the idea that there's some causal force. So why am I telling it? Why am I reminding you of this? Because you might think, oh, well, if you want to study essentialism, just find out ask people what the essence is. And that's actually the last place you want to look, because that's not really even filled out. It's just this placeholder. So we'll see. So the approach that I have used, my collaborators and other people who studied essentialism, is to look at some of these consequences of this structure. And it's not until the my last piece of evidence, and I'll say a little bit about something that looks like that. It's more like converging indirect evidence for categories as stable and informative and biologically based. Okay, so I'm going to zip through different kinds of methods that have been used with children. They're all simple. They're based on tasks that even preschoolers can engage in. But as I go through them, think about sort of the concept that the child has to have to behave the way they do on these simple tasks. So if you show children items where there seems to be a certain superficial appearance, but you give labels that contradict that superficial appearance. So this is a lizard, a snake, and a lizard. This is indeed a lizard. So, you know, the natural world gives us all kinds of really interesting examples where appearances are misleading. This is called a glass lizard, like this. A young child will say that this lizard has the same internal properties as this lizard, even though it looks more like the snake. They say essentially that nature overrides nurture. So if you tell them about a baby rabbit that is raised by a set of monkeys, they believe that this rabbit will grow up to prefer carrots to bananas, to be good at hopping rather than climbing trees. And that a baby boy who goes to live on an island populated entirely by females will nonetheless grow up to prefer playing football and other sort of boy pursuits. They report that category boundaries are objectively correct. So if you show them, for example, pictures of two individuals, for a girl and a boy, and then you tell them about a character, Feppy, who comes from a faraway land, and Feppy and all of his friends say that these are the same kind of person, could they possibly be right? And young children will say, no, they could not possibly be right. You have to consider these as different kinds of people. So imposing this category boundary and saying it's objectively correct, even in the face of evidence that things are done differently in a different place. And this extends to culturally specific social categories as well. So this is work that Gil Diesendruck and colleagues have done, where kids, Jewish secular children in Israel, again, say that there's only one right way to group these people. So the two Orthodox Jewish people go together and not this Muslim person, despite, again, someone in another society who says that actually they would say that these are the same kind of people, and can say, well, that's just wrong. It's objectively, there's only one right way to do this. They say that insights matter. Now, this is interesting from the standpoint of kids thinking that it's giving us a little hint about what that inner essence might be that's causally responsible for properties that members of the category have. So we did a couple of studies that were inspired by reports that different physicians who were engaged in doing organ transplants wrote up. There are a couple of reports out there in the literature where these physicians said, wow, it's kind of interesting. Some of our patients are reporting sort of worries about who's donating the organ that they're going to get, and wondering whether they're going to be different following the transplant because maybe they're going to take on characteristics of the donor. And so we did a set of studies with adults in the US and India, and found that about 30 to 50% of US adults who do not have organ transplants have that same belief that if they get a heart from someone else, they will slightly take on characteristics of that person, as if the inner part has a causal consequence. So we asked this of young children as well, 5 to 7-year-olds, and they report that if they get a heart from a pig, for example, they'll start to act and feel just a bit more like a pig. And we had a control where what was transferred was not an inner part, and they don't show the effect there. Or that if they get a heart from someone who's, you know, very mean, they will get a little bit more mean, and so on. Okay, so by about 4 to 5 years of age, young children show robust essentialist expectations on these different converging tasks. And I think this is important for showing that even in early childhood, we sometimes think, oh, concepts are sort of built from the ground up, from like sort of perceptual features sort of accumulate until finally we get to see real concepts. But instead, what we're seeing is that there's this expectation really early in development that concepts make room for features that the child does not yet know. And I think this suggests that essentialism is, you know, what you might call easy to think, a basic human predisposition. Okay, so, but as I said at the beginning, that's not the whole story. Cultural context matters. Now this is, the way that cultural context matters is sort of a big issue that I could spend the whole hour on. I'm not going to do that, but I want to sort of give you a brief overview and then dig into a couple of examples, just to make the point. Okay, so this is a world map where each map pin indicates a part of the world where a research team has looked at essentialism, either in children or adults or different ages. And you can see that people have been very interested in kind of mapping out where we see essentialism or don't see essentialism across the world. This is by no means exhaustive. I just kind of stopped when I got kind of a nice representation of all the continents except Antarctica. I don't, as far as I know, no one's looked at essentialism in Antarctica. And if I can sort of generalize from this, this represents over 7,000 participants and dozens of studies. But there are two like broad generalizations one can make across all of this, which is one, if you look at people's beliefs about animal categories, like, you know, dog and cat, or physical features of humans, you know, like their height or hair color, things like that, you see clear essentialist reasoning, you know, across the board. This does not seem to be something particular to the US, to the middle class, to the samples that were initially looking at these sorts of questions. But the other point is that when you're looking at social categories, ways of grouping people, ways of dividing up the wonderful variety of you know, the human category into different kinds of people, you see huge variability. You see some cases where, you know, so there's some categories that people don't even imagine, like caste in India, which is essentialized by high caste members, that, you know, people in other parts of the world don't even use that as an organizing structure. Or you see cases where, you know, race is essentialized much more in one context than another context. Or you see cases where with development, essentialism increases. Or you see cases where with development, essentialism decreases. You see like kind of any possible pattern when it comes to social categories. So tremendous variability. So we have to take this as very serious evidence that there's something about the cultural context that is making a difference in when people apply this sort of basic essentialist understanding, which seems to fit people's conceptions of, you know, biological species, when and why do they apply it to people? So I want to give two examples where we can see this variation. And the first example, I want you to really kind of notice for a moment, look, we're talking about all of Earth, but the examples that I'm going to show you are both, the first example I'm going to show you is from right here. And I'm going to tell you about two communities that are only 75 miles apart. And to me, that's very interesting, actually, because you can start to see, wow, why would cultural context matter when you have two communities that are right next to each other? And this is work that I did with Marjorie Rhodes. This was her dissertation study. We looked at these two towns in Michigan. Hopefully, you know, Michigan's the mitten. And I can tell you this is Ann Arbor. That's not like a big surprise. And I won't tell you the name of this town, but it's in this, you know, this sort of neighboring community. They differ on a number of dimensions. We can't isolate what makes the difference, but I'll just tell you some of the differences. Politically very different. Ann Arbor, very, very right wing. I mean, left wing, sorry. I can't believe I said that. They're not gonna let me back in.
Only in comparison to
When my kids were, you know, they have these mock elections in their schools, like in middle school. And I remember one of my kids coming home after they did a mock election in like 2008, I think it was. And I said, oh, how did the vote come out? Well, like Obama, of course, got by far the most votes. And then the third party candidate got the second amount of votes. And the Republican candidate was like trailing something along. Okay, so the rural area, very, very conservative. Politically, you can get the data on, you know, whether people voted for the more conservative or more liberal candidate in a variety of elections, and it's like the opposite of Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is relatively diverse, which is not hugely diverse compared to like LA or New York, but the rural area, I think, was something like 97% white. They varied in terms of the education level of the parents, higher in Ann Arbor than the rural community. The size of the town was very different. The rural town had like a few thousand people total, and so on. In other respects, though, you know, they're all in Michigan. They have the same kind of schooling, these were public schools and the same kinds of curricula and so on. So we were interested in essentialist reasoning in these two communities and whether children would show different developmental patterns, and in fact they did. Now, I'm not going to show you every one highly essentialized animal kinds and didn't essentialize artifacts like tables and chairs, so I won't show you those data, but I will show you the data on gender and race. And the task that we used was one of these tasks that used the objective boundaries task that I mentioned earlier with Pepe and all of his friends. And what we see, so first I'll show you gender, then I'll show you race. And this is just percent showing an essentialist response. So with gender, what you see is at the youngest ages, children are highly essentialist about gender, and it didn't matter which community they were in. But then around middle childhood, responses diverged. So the rural community stayed high on gender. This is up through 12th grade. But the Ann Arbor kids actually got less essentialist about gender. They were learning not to essentialize gender. How about race? Race was the opposite. At 5 and 7, there was low essentialism of race that stayed low in Ann Arbor, possibly even dropping slightly, but it increased in the conservative community, the rural community. So in the conservative community, kids were learning to essentialize race. So there's something really important there about the messages that these children are getting. Okay. Now I want to tell you about my second example. This is work that I've done with Stephen Roberts. And we used a task that was inspired by some work that Katie Kinsler and Jocelyn Dowtell did. Although they were looking at kids' concepts of language and race. Here we were particularly interested in concepts of race. And the task was such that on each of a series of trials, kids would see a picture of a child. Sometimes it was white, sometimes black, sometimes girl, sometimes boy, didn't matter. And they're told, like, okay, see this kid. I want you to tell me which one of these two people I'm going to show you is this kid when they're grown up. And what you can see is that there are two sort of dimensions that kids might use, and they're pitted against each other. So they could use race, well, like she's white, she's black. So I'm going to say, well, race is stable over time. If I have an essentialist view about race, I don't think it's something that can transform. But on the other hand, there's emotional expression. So this kid is smiling, she's smiling, she looks angry. Now, quite scary, actually. And children know there's a lot of research looking at how children reason about emotions, and it's a very, interesting area with a lot of complexity. But kids do know at a young age that emotions are changeable over time. Someone can be happy one moment, crying the next moment, and so on. So we thought, okay, this, in a way, that should be an easy task of kind of stability of race, that aspect of race essentialism. And kids should say that she would grow up to be this person. But on the other hand, if they don't really grasp race as a stable, essentialized kind, then they may not show that pattern. Okay, so let me show you what we found. And you'll see, I will show how often the orange bars, how often they match by emotion, how often they matched by race, the blue. And these are 4 different groups. So we start with white younger kids, white 5 to 6-year-olds. They were a chance. They really didn't have a preference as to which way to go, in contrast to white 9 to 10-year-olds and white adults. So the adult pattern is, well, of course, race is stable. You can't just shift from white to black. They have that firmly by 9 to 10, but the 5 to 6-year-olds don't have that yet. They really seem to have a different construal of race. But interestingly, we also had a group of racial minority 5 to 6-year-olds from the same community, and they look like the adults and 9 to 10-year-olds who are white. So it's suggesting, so I'm just highlighting those differences. There's something about the experiences of the racial minority children that differ from the experiences of the white children that corresponds to different ways of conceptualizing race. Again, neither of these examples that I'm showing you tells you what that might be. And here's where I want to say something about language. My last point will be about ways in which, so language, of course, is such an important component of social transmission in the human race, So language can transmit beliefs explicitly. I can tell you, like, that mushroom is poisonous, don't eat it. That's an explicit message that has survival consequences for a child who has a language. But I will be focusing on implicit messages in language, not what the explicit propositional content is, but the implicit sort of underlying implications of language maybe. And you'll see, I'm focusing on one aspect of language. So we've done a bunch of, as Tamar mentioned, I'm really interested in parent-child conversations and what is going on in those contexts. And we've done a number of studies where we've looked at, we bring parents and children into the lab together, and we look at how they talk, and we give them different kinds of contexts and so on. I'm going to tell you about the very first study I did using this method with my wonderful co-authors. And what we did, we designed a study that I thought, okay, so I was finding all of these essentialist effects. I was really interested in what parents were telling children about the essential nature of categories. And so we had a parent-child reading book test, because this is a test that parents and children are very comfortable with in our culture. These were young children, so prior to the ages at which they were showing essentialist effects, I thought that's where you want to see sort of what kind of messages are coming through. We had these specially prepared books that we designed that were eliciting child naming errors. We got tons of child naming errors because we had, just like that legless lizard I showed you, there are all these many examples of cases where something looks like one thing, but is really something else. We had helpful labels on the page that the parents were able to read because they're literate. And things like a bat that looked like a bird or a car that looked like a boot and so on. And so we thought, this is great. This is going to get parents to discuss non-obvious properties. We'd see like which components of essentialism are they pulling out and which ones are the kids picking up on. Like this was going to be our part one, and then we would see like how kids pick up on the messages that parents are providing. And we did this detailed set of analyses of the parent-child talk, parent-child gesture. I won't be talking about the gesture. That was very interesting, your questions. And we did this whole big thing. And any of you who've done, you know, transcriptional studies, you know, it's a huge amount of effort. I mean, transcribing alone takes hours and hours for each hour of speech. And developing a coding system when you're sort of, you know, hacking your way through the forest trying to find a path. It's hard, time consuming. And I was like so sad when we had our data because we got virtually zero talk about any of the factors that I thought parents might be telling children, like immutability, biological basis, category boundaries, inner essences, none of that. However, we did notice that parents were systematically talking differently about the animal categories and the artifact categories. And these were very precisely designed books so that we were controlling for perceptual similarity and thematic relations and so forth. Things were like very tightly constructed so that we'd be able to compare the animals and the artifacts. And what we saw, and I'm telling you the results for this study, but we found it in many different subsequent studies, is here was this frequent tendency to sort of jump up a level when they're talking about the items in the book. So the items in the book are individual instances of whatever categories they are. But the parents would sometimes talk about the categories to which these instances belong. Like they would talk about bats, or they would talk about chipmunks, or they would talk about seals, or whatever the category was, and they would do this much more often for the animals than the artifacts. So these are parent data, parents of 35-month-olds. We had 2 different sets of books, parents of 20-month-olds, and it's very, very systematically that this was this choosing to shift the focus of attention from individual instances to the category, is what I mean when I say generic language, and the generic language was much more common for certain kinds of categories. The categories that we essentialize. As I mentioned before, we don't essentialize things like cups and tables. This is, it turns out, I thought I had discovered generics, and it turns out I certainly had not. There's this long, very, you know, well, theoretically kind of well-developed literature in linguistics and philosophy on generics. So I'm going to give you some examples because I think it's important for you to see kind of intuitively how they work, and then I'm going to tell you some of the messages that I think are implicit in generics and the generic language kids are here. So generics are frequent. Like if you, any Wikipedia article on an animal category, you're gonna find generics. This is a challenge to you. If you go on Wikipedia and find one that doesn't have any generics, tell me, because I'll give you $20. Horses are animals of habit that respond well to regimentation. Wikipedia. Children's books, full of generics, especially informational books. The elephant is the only mammal that cannot jump. Parents to children, as I mentioned, this is one of the rare artifact generics, actually. A wok is how people in China cook. And we have found it in other languages as well. In fact, generics appear to be a human universal. How they're expressed differs from language to language, but the capacity to talk about broad kinds that go beyond individuals is present in every language, as far as I know, that's ever been studied. This was from a project that I did with Twyla Tardif in Chinese. Do big rats bite people or not? We have done a project looking at Quechua parents and kids in Peru. Quechua is a Native American language, again, generics, what the dogs eat. And kids start producing generics at about 2.5. Okay, so now I want to tell you about some of the implications. Generics gloss over exceptions. This is really important. So, you could say something like, do birds fly, or the positive birds fly. The answer to do birds fly is yes. And even if the only birds in the context are non-flying birds, the answer to do birds fly is still yes. And children know this by preschool age. We studied it and found that this will answer in that way. Generics do not simply tell you something about frequency, but something instead about whether a feature seems core to the category. So like birds fly, I said there are exceptions, but still most birds fly. But then you can also say lions have manes, but really only the female lions have manes. You can say lions have manes, even though half of them don't. And we can even say, this is an example that Sarah Jane Leslie made famous. Mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus, even though less than 1% of mosquitoes carry the West Nile virus. So that's kind of interesting, maybe even a bit perplexing about why you can make this generalization. And if you're starting to think, well, maybe anything that's true of some members of the category, you can say this way. No, you can't say people have PhDs. It doesn't seem like a good sentence, right? Even though it's probably like roughly similar likelihood. You don't say lions are male. That doesn't seem like a good generalization, even though more lions are male than have manes, right? Because, this would also exclude baby lions who are female. So this is actually a larger category, but it's a worse generic. Or turtles die in infancy. The vast majority of turtles die in infancy. But it doesn't somehow seem like a good generic. Okay. So there's something about the feature being expressed and how core it is to your concept. Very interesting window onto, kind of which features people think are important. And again, preschoolers grasp this. Like they think sentences like, this one kind of study we looked at, they think lions have manes is good, lions are males bad, even if they know exactly, that only male lions have manes. Furthermore, generics exaggerate prevalence. So on the one hand, as I just said, you can assert a generic on the basis of animal evidence.
Sorry, I think I did that.
But on the other hand, generics imply a strong link between category and property and therefore high prevalence. And so there's this asymmetry where people tend to exaggerate the prevalence relative to the evidence. So let me get concrete about what I mean by that exaggeration. This is work that I've done with Andre Simpian and Amanda Brandoni. You can introduce a new category, these are correlates. You can tell people 70% of correlates have spots, and then ask them, is it true or false that correlates have spots? And they'll typically say true, correlates have spots. But now you can do the reverse. You tell them correlates have spots, and then you ask them what percentage of correlates have spots. and they will, on average, say 95% of correlates have spots. So that gap between the evidence that you need, which is actually a lot, fairly low, and the implication is quite high. There's an asymmetry there. And in fact, Amanda Brandoni and Jenna Hedgelin and I have looked at this issue with kids as well as adults, and we find that people assume this asymmetry for generics, typically not for quantifiers. It's a whole interesting additional story about generics versus quantifiers. If anyone's interested in, you can ask questions. I think there may be real world implications of this asymmetry, although we're only just now starting to look at this. But you could imagine, like sexist or racist statements, someone can make a statement like girls don't like math on the basis of minimal evidence. They know that that's like there are plenty of exceptions, but you know, it's a generic, you can gloss over exceptions. But then what about a child who doesn't know about the exceptions yet? They're hearing that input, they may exaggerate the implications there. Or political discourse, again, someone can make a statement like welfare recipients cheat the system and may know about exceptions, but what's the uptake? Or scientific communication. I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular because I have since gone back and seen that I use tons of generics in my own scientific writing, so I'm not one to cast stones, but we have a lot of generic statements like socially excluded people alter the self to gain social connection, where that's a generalization that may be read as very broadly true, but at the same time we know that you know, as the scientists who do the work, we're well aware of the variation in our own data. So we have a project, Jasmine DeJesus, Maureen Callanan, and Graciela Solis and I have been looking at generics in scientific communication. I'll briefly tell you about that. We've looked at 11 psychology journals, and every single article that was published in 2015 and 2016 in these 11 journals. It was over 1,100 articles, nearly 14,000 codable elements. We looked at titles, highlights, and abstracts because we're especially interested in what happens when a writer is forced to condense and condense and condense what they're trying to communicate. And what we found, 22% of sentences that were, well, we only looked at sentences reporting results, 22% were generic, 90% of articles included at least one generic. There were more generics for articles that did not specify participant SES. Generic frequency was not correlated with sample size, so it's not like, oh, if you have a nationally representative sample, then you're more likely to do generics. No, I mean, you could have a study in some cases with like 10 people and still see generics. And we've been doing actually more than one study now where we experimentally manipulate the wording, and people judge that findings that have generic wording are more important and more generalizable than findings that don't have generic wording. And just so you can see how the length of the unit forces more generics. Titles that were, these are titles that were full sentences. Most titles are not sentences at all, so going to be coded. The vast majority of them are generic. Highlights were somewhat less so, and abstracts less than that. So this move to have you know, research highlights at a very limited length seems to foster generics, which makes sense because in English generics are shorter. Okay, generics also imply norms. This is a very quick, in one slide, many studies that my wonderful former student, Stephen Roberts, has done, where he used a minimal groups paradigm, teaching children about novel groups that differ only in superficial ways, like Hibble's eat this kind of berry, Clark's eat this kind of berry, so you see the generic language. And when children hear generic language, then when they see someone who goes against the rule, this glurk is eating this kind of berries. It's a glurk, but it's eating a hibbleberry. Young children think this is really bad. And generics imply essentialism. So we've done this looking at animal categories, and Rhodes et al. Done this in social categories, but we introduced a new category. And in a picture book context, and the kids have the book read to them multiple times over a couple of weeks, and page after page after page tells them something about this category, with the wording varying systematically between conditions. So either every single page is generic, Zarpies love to eat tulips, or specific, but with a label, or with no label at all. And we find that college students, parents, and children all are most likely to have essentialist inferences about the category when it was stated with generic language. Okay, so, oh, this is almost like, I thought this was funny because I now get, you know how we all get spam? I started getting spam to present at medical conferences about generics because of generic drugs. I think it would be so fun to accept one of these invitations and say, let me tell you about generics. That would be funny. Okay, so generics gloss over exceptions, they express core features, they exaggerate prevalence, they imply norms, they imply essentialism. So generics may tell children which categories to essentialize. I do not think that generics are the basis of why we essentialize to begin with. I want to be clear about that. But I think generics may tell kids, oh, here's a category that you can draw inferences about, where the exceptions don't really matter, where there is some kind of normative basis and so on. Now, I think a really interesting, completely open question that I have no data on, but I have related data that may be provocative in this regard, is do generics also tell children how much to essentialize? So at the level of a specific category, the claim is if you hear a lot of generics about Zarpies, you're more likely to essentialize Zarpies. But what if you're hearing just a lot of generics all the way around? Do you have sort of like a different perspective on categories than someone who's not hearing them? And what we have seen, so I just want to mention that in our various studies looking at parent-child conversations, we have seen individual variation, pedagogical context variation, and language and cultural variation that is provocative in this regard. As I said, no data on whether this corresponds to different levels of essentialism. Individual variation, this is just one example. We did a study where we had 72 parent-child pairs coming into the lab. They came in at 2 different visits. They each had a session where the parent-child talked together, and then each one also talked separately to an experimenter, and then they did this at different points in time. And we found modest sort of predictiveness, correlation between visit 1 and visit 2 in the parents. So the parents, and I'm just focusing here on the parent-child speech. It's actually a much tighter correlation if you look at just the parent talking to an experimenter. But there is some consistency over time. And you can, if you look at these numbers, some of the parents were up to like 40-some% of their utterances were generic. Okay, well, this is a book reading task, but still. And then others were very, very low. Like some of them only had generics in one session and not the other. So some seem to like really love generics, and some seem to really, avoid them. Pedagogical context does reliably seem to generate more generics. So this is just an example from a study that Twyla Tardif and I did. If you look at a book reading context, a toy play context with just certain normal toys, and then mechanical toy play where the toys are really, really active and sort of like you just push the button and they start doing things. Much, much higher levels of generics in book reading. So there's something about a book reading context, which actually is also the context we typically have used to look at parent-child conversation. And furthermore, when you experimentally manipulate the adult instructions, whether the adult are asked to take on a pedagogical role, pretend to be a teacher, pretend to be a peer, pretend you're talking to someone who doesn't know very much, pretend you're talking to a peer, and also in books themselves, whether they're informational or narrative. Again, vast differences in generic. So it seems like if the context is pedagogical, that really ups the generic language. And then language and cultural differences. I only have a little snippet of information about this, but this was from a study, the same study that Tardif and I did, looking at English speakers in the US and Mandarin speakers in Beijing, and finding that there were, and these are very young kids, these were like toddlers, and the parents in the US were more likely to produce generics compared to the parents in China. So let me conclude and say a couple of things about future directions. I really think, you know, when I started looking at essentialism, I really thought, oh, you know, children's essentialist reasoning shows how smart children are. They don't just use surface appearances. They understand that non-obvious features can be really important. The whole scientific enterprise rests on assuming that there's a deeper reality that we can uncover. So I thought of essentialism as contributing to one of the best aspects of human behavior, the search for deeper truths. But then the more I studied and thought about essentialism of social kinds, the more I was convinced that essentialism can also contribute to the worst of human behavior. So in gender stereotyping and discrimination, and misconceptions in science, like I talked about earlier. Cultural context seems to shape when children apply this perspective, and I think that generic language is one mechanism, not the only mechanism, one very interesting mechanism for conveying implicit messages to children that children are very receptive to at a young age. And I just want to briefly mention 3 future directions that we've been working on recently. One is the question of what is the role of direct personal experiences that run counter to essentialist dogma. And this is a project I'm very fortunate to get to collaborate with Christina Olson, who's a psychologist at the University of Washington, who has a project on transgender youth. And she's been looking at kids who are gender nonconforming, their siblings, so they're gender typical kids who have a sibling who's gender nonconforming, and then children who are just gender typical children, not from a family with that's one of her key focus. And what we are looking at is essentialism. So Olson has a number of really interesting findings about gender stereotyping and gender concepts in these populations. And we're looking at essentialism of sex and essentialism of gender identity. A second issue is what essentialist messages are conveyed when children learn about genes. There's a number of studies suggesting that the adult uptake of the science of genetics is misconstrued, which some people call genetic essentialism, and we're looking at this in children. And what happens when the generic lens is turned on the self? So this is work I've been doing with Ethan Cross, who's a social psychologist, and Ariana Orwell, who's a graduate student at Michigan. And we are looking at generic language that is focused on persons, and every language has some means of talking about one's individual experiences in broader kind of generic terms. And we're finding some very interesting sort of predictive features of what are the contexts in which people do this, and then what are the downstream consequences of shifting from sort of an immersed perspective of what's happening in the moment to a generic perspective on one's life events. So I want to thank you so much.
I'm going to raise my hand. I told you. So lovely, so fun, so many ideas. So we, for our seminar, just read Christina Olson's paper on the trend.
Oh, yeah.
And then I teach a class on play, and we just did some work on looking at, you know, the marketing of gendered toys and so on.
Oh,
And and that in some places in Scandinavia, they're trying to use a gender neutral.
Yes, yeah, there's some beautiful work by Kristen Schultz.
Yeah.
Looking at gender neutral preschools in Sweden, I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It's first of all, it's so important for someone to study these different kinds of contexts. And she does find like lower rates of gender stereotyping. But she also, it doesn't disappear either.
Right.
Now you could say, well, you know, the preschool is set within a broader context, of course. It's within a societal context, a family context, a peer context that's not limited to just that preschool. So is it that that environment is not sort of all-encompassing enough to change children's concepts? Or is it that children will see gender differences and try to understand those, and they'll apply an essentialist lens even when the environment doesn't tell you? So I think it gives us important new data, and it also opens up additional questions.
Yeah.
But I love that work. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you think their essentialist approaches might be if they're going to be mitigated, because the label isn't there to sort of reinforce that distinction.
Yes, it's not there in the preschool.
No.
That doesn't mean they're not getting it somewhere else. Like the neighbor, you know, the neighbor kids that maybe they play with on the weekend, who don't go to that school. And, you know, so I think that's not, you can't control for the kinds of input that they may be getting from other sources. We've also noticed this whole implicit explicit thing that, so we did, one of our parent-child studies was looking at, specifically at gender. And we had 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and the parents come in. We had these specially prepared books that had half the pages were gender stereotypical and half were gender non-stereotypical. So it would either be like a female firefighter or a male firefighter. And one thing that was really interesting about this was that the parents were very, very egalitarian in what they explicitly said. They would say, like, I don't think, so the kids were so sexist. Like, they were saying all these crazy things, like, you know, like, would you like to, you know, so a page about, like, you know, someone driving a truck. Would you like to drive a truck? And the girl saying, well, only if it's a pink truck. You know, so the kids were very sexist. The parents were trying so hard. Now, granted, it may have been that they knew that they were being video recorded, but they're like, oh, you know, we're gender egalitarian here. You know, they didn't quite use that language, but that was like the message over and over. But then they would say things like, is that a boy toy or a girl toy? Or, really? You think that, you know, girls could be soldiers, or, you know, whatever it was. And then there were even ones that, like, I haven't talked about at all, but there's this really nice set of papers by Chestnut and Markman where they find that comparative statements, like if you say, girls are just as good at math as boys. That sounds great, right? No, the message that is taken away is boys are good at math, and then girls can be compared to boys, and they don't like really live up to it. So I don't think parents are aware of those sort of subtleties. So I would also be interested in, you know, even in those gender neutral preschools, you know, what's being said. I think it would be fascinating to do like sort of a parallel study of the language being spoken by the kids and to the kids throughout the day. Yeah.
That was a great talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question, and that is whether you or anyone else has done much on secular changes in generic speaking and essentialism. And the reason I ask is that I'm editing a book on Hidden Modern Law. I'm literally sending it out to the publisher today. And one of the themes of the book or many of the chapters is that hate has been increasing. Listening to your talk, which is not on hate, it strikes me as really relevant because not only does there seem to be a lot more generic talk than there used to be. People were Republicans or this way, people were Democrats or this way, but worse, maybe it's true. Maybe people are becoming more stereotyped. That there is more unity in the Republican Party, and there's more unity in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, the whole polarization.
And as both the generic thinking increases and the actual generic reality increases psychologically, it increases hatred because it brings people apart.
Yeah. I really think that's so interesting. It reminds me, there's this concept that Ian Hacking, a philosopher, introduced many years ago, where he calls the looping effects of humankind. And he talks about how when we form a social I don't know, I'm not really doing justice to it, but when we form social categories, it creates a reality that then members of that category sort of instantiate, and then it supports it all the more, and it's like sort of a vicious cycle kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, and it ties into this whole thing of polarization and why has polarization increased, or I mean, it seems to have increased, and how would one measure it? And so I think it may depend on the content though, because my sense is very much in agreement with yours when it comes to sort of political discourse in this country, and maybe people truly are sort of moving into different, more distinct and disparate political positions. But then, you know, I think how people talk and think about gender is going the opposite way. And people are, you know, this whole idea of non-binary and so forth is, you know, not something that, say, you know, someone who wasn't like a feminist theorist would have thought about 30 years ago, probably. So I think there are cultural shifts in terms of, you know, kind of increases or decreases. I'd love to be able to study that. It's hard. The problem is I would love to be able to do a big data analysis of generic language, but it's hard because you need the context. You can't, it's not plural. You know, like if it were just plural, I could have like some collaboration with a programmer and we could like suck up all the data of, you know, large data sets and look at trends over time and so forth. But the problem is you can't classify things as generic or specific without knowing the full context in which it says. Very time consuming, and you have to get reliability, of course, and all of that. You know, maybe someday someone will figure out a way to reliably code utterances as generic or specific based on sort of aspects of the context, and do it in an automated way. And then it would be really interesting then to look over historical time. Yes.
Two short questions. What do you think are the functions of essentializing? And do you think non-human animals?
I'm going to start with the second one because this is something. There was a paper that came out like maybe a year or two ago, and then an older paper by Lori Santos and colleagues, but the more recent one was done at Max Planck, where they show what looks like sort of, and they talk about it as essentialism. It looks like kind of simple essentialism in non-human apes. And it is this very, very clever study. If you get the paper online, I think it was in Science, you can download the video and see how they actually do the study. But they basically take like a little sample of banana and a little sample of carrot, and then in front of the eyes of the subject, they transform either the carrot to look like the banana or the banana to look like the carrot, and so they look identical, but then they give the animal a choice of which food they want, and you have to know a priori, which is well established, that they prefer bananas to carrots, and so they will pick it's a little complicated because they didn't find it. There's one condition where they didn't find it, but basically what they do, the animal overlooks the superficial appearances and picks the fruit with the identity that they know to be the case. So like you could say, okay, there's a little bit of essentialism there. You don't have to see the property to think that that's part of what it really and truly is. On the other hand, the only way they had to convey that was the animal watching this sort of laborious, kind of strange process where someone did a transformation. And then like, I'm thinking, okay, compare that to the case where we show 4-year-olds, and in some studies we've gone down to like slightly under 3, where we, show the kids something that looks like a snake, and we say, oh, this is actually a lizard, and then the kids make inferences based on a lizard. So in human language, all you have to do is give a label, and you've communicated something really important about the identity of that thing. With these animals, the only way that you can see that essentialism is if there's a shared experience in front of them. So I think that's like, so I think that there are like maybe like little bits of components that map onto something like essentialism, but it's so much narrower the context in which you can see it. Now the functions of essentialism, that's a great question. And I think, I happen to think that essentialism is not actually just one thing, although I've talked about it as if it's one thing throughout this whole talk. But I think that there are sort of, I think it's an outgrowth of sort of propensities to learn that we see throughout, at all ages, including young children, that have functional benefit for survival in the world. So one of them might be, for example, causal determinism. So the assumption that if you see regularity in the world, it must have some cause. And in some cases, that cause will be really obvious, and you don't have to dig deep to say that there's like a cause there. All you have to do is say like, oh, well, like I know that you drew that picture, so that, regularity that this looks like a dog is because you created it, and I know how human action works and intention and so on. But in other cases, there are irregularities that don't have any clear cause at all. A lot of it in the natural world are these discontinuities in the natural world. People going back to Rosh have talked about that. And kids kind of observe that, and not in any sort of deliberate way, but at a very intuitive level. It's like, these discontinuities in the world must have some sort of underlying cause. Now, we know that kids are very good causal learners. We know that kids search for causes, make use of statistical information to find causes. They're very, very good at causal reasoning. That's super helpful for, functioning and surviving. So that's an example of that's just like one example of a sort of component that has functional benefit. I don't think causal determinism is like for essentialism, but I think they're like these different components when they all sort of come together. They often really come together nicely when we're reasoning about the animal world or animal species, ends up looking like essentialism.
That was really fun to see you put that all together. I was wondering your thoughts about the degree to which somebody thinking that a category is consistent over time versus licenses some important inferences would be differentially indicative of essentialist thought. So I'm thinking about the race example in particular. Right. So like with the 5-year-olds, I think not thinking that race is consistent over time would be evidence of the absence of essentialist thought, but it's less clear to me that thinking that it's consistent over time, you'd probably be hard pressed to find an adult who doesn't go with consistency, yet you probably find variance in licensing of inferences.
Yes.
Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, very much so. So this sort of gets back to my offhand comment that I don't think essentialism is all one thing. One example that to me is very compelling is like how people think about age. And so certainly we have like very deep inferences we make about like what teenagers are like, or what babies are like, or, you know, someone could be very stereotyped about like the elderly or that kind of thing. And so you could have like powerful inferences that you think that these age categories have predictive value, they go deep, they, you know, may not be obvious and so on. But certainly age is like, there's nothing more variable than age, you know, like it or not, we keep getting older. And so, or you can have the reverse, like the example of like, are you right-handed or left-handed? You know, there are different theories as to why, but certainly that seems to be something that's relatively immutable. You know, whether or not it's genetic is debatable, but, and yet it doesn't seem to go very far in the, I mean, sometimes people do try to push it. Some people say, oh, if you're left-handed, you're more creative and all of that, but I would say generally speaking, that's one of these categories that seems immutable, but not very deep. So yeah, and I think the race example, well, that's interesting too, though, because it's not even clear, though, that young kids, so what you said about adults, definitely, like any adult would say race is stable. Well, almost any adult would say race is stable over time. There's that famous example of Rachel Dolezal, who did not treat race as stable over time. But generally speaking, yes. And yet, as you say, there's huge variability in how much people essentialize race. Kids, I'm not sure if they have any of the components of essentialism. Yes. Yeah.
I was thinking, and you mentioned this, that generics are also great ways to express norms, social norms,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
whites do this, young people do this.
Right.
Good kids, good boys do this, good girls.
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking if there isn't any merit to or research on the idea that the kinds of social norms that are enacted in some societies are going to track or correlate with the kinds of properties that are essentialized in those cultures.
I would love to. I was thinking about it as an individual difference kind of question, but I think it definitely extends to cultural variation as well. As far as I know, no one has tracked to see if like endorsement of generics correlates with endorsement of essentialism, but I would expect that they may go together. And so it may be that if you look at the generic language that people use in different cultural contexts, that may be sort of an index of which features. You have to be careful because generics, I mean, I want to be clear, even though I think generics have these sort of essentialist implications, what is stated is not the essence itself. So like, you know, if I say lions have manes, yeah, I think manes are sort of like really important to my concept of a lion, but I don't think the mane is like causally responsible for its internal features or anything like that. It's not the essence in that sense. So it's an indicator that people are thinking about the kind as sort of like a unit about which they can, you know, productively make inferences that have normative implications and so forth, where you can, you know, gloss over the exceptions and all of that. But it's not going to be a perfect match onto like what the essence is. But it may tell you something about like how people are stereotyped in that category.
I think just one more, because at 2 you have another meeting.
Okay.
Is it just
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between essentialism and stereotyping. So especially,
Yes.
for example, with the example of gender, because we just heard, okay, so especially when they're young, they endorse these essentialist beliefs, and they also seem to be kind of sexist in their assumptions about who does what. But then you showed us data showing that essentialism, at least in certain categories, seems to decrease.
Right.
But does that mean that stereotyping also decreases? Because I can imagine someone not ascribing these beliefs, but still assuming certain things about gender and then judging people based on that. So
it's complicated. Here's the thing, that absolutely any consideration of how essentialism and stereotyping relate to one another has to kind of grapple with the point that when it comes to categories of race, for example, there's a positive correlation. When it comes to categories of sexual orientation, there's a negative correlation. So if you think about it, who is most likely to be essentialist about sexual orientation? It's the people who are, you know, most accepting and favorable towards, you know, like LGBTQ individuals. Because like the idea, so a really right-wing sort of anti-gay rhetoric is, it's a matter of choice. It's anti-essentialist. The sort of pro-gay marriage, left-wing position is, this is how people are born that way, you know, etc. So there you get the opposite. And this, I think, relates to the idea that essentialism can be used to, I mean, not like in a deliberate way, but essentialism, it can be used to sort of validate or break down certain social structures. And this is sometimes why you see that, like I sort of alluded to with the caste system, but this is not the only example of this. People who benefit from that structure, like the Brahmins, are more likely to essentialize. This is work by my colleague from Mohammedan. And then the Dalit, or the so-called untouchables, are say, this is not like inborn. This is a social construction that disadvantages, you know, my group, and there's no inherent reality to it. So I think, you know, it's complicated by, you know, what's the on the ground experience of people, what's a political reality, and I don't even know if these like positive and negative correlations would be the same across historical time. It may be when like the historical conditions change, maybe some of those relationships change as well. I think it's an open question. So I'd say there's no like necessary positive relationship between essentialism and stereotyping. But very great question.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Susan.
Sorry.
It was a nice talk. Sort of connect her stuff that I think
Nice to see you.